Chapter 9, Time Management, is a topic that you have had covered in multiple courses. So we're going to hit the highlights here and focus on time management from a leadership perspective. Time management is making optimal use of available time. And if you're in a position of leadership, the available time window shrinks daily. It is so important to remember that there is a close relationship between time management and stress. It is not uncommon, especially for new leaders, to become less rigorous in their time management with increasing stress. So having a methodical, thoughtful plan for how they manage their time that begins at the beginning of the day will help mitigate some of that being pulled in multiple directions without any real good direction throughout the day. This is the list of some symptoms of poor time management. I want you to take a look at this and see if any of these feel familiar. 3 basic steps in time management. It's so important to allow time to plan for established priorities. You want to establish those priorities and have clarity about them. Priorities land kind of in 3 buckets. Don't do, which are things that will resolve on their own or you don't own it. Do now, these are things that are specific to your role and responsibility that require your emergent attention. When they're big things, I'm going to encourage you to break them down, break larger projects down into smaller ones and to set deadlines for each of those. And again, these are due now projects. And then the things that are due later. Oftentimes the due later things are long-term projects, professional development, things that relate to strategic planning that you have some time to process and to think about. So you do have some time to do them later. It's not uncommon for people to use a priority task organizer, either 3 columns of priority A, B, C. A being the things that I have to do today, B being the things that I have to do but I have time to plan, and C are the if I have time, I'll get to them, and if I don't, nothing bad happens. However you approach this, it's important to not only plan your time, but to establish the priorities that occur in that time so that at the end of the day, you've accomplished what's necessary to accomplish. The other thing to focus on is being willing to be flexible throughout the day so that as you have planned, as you've created your prioritized list, that if something happens and something gets added or something gets removed to your plate for the day, that you can be flexible and be willing to reprioritize based on the fluidity of the situation that you exist in from a leadership perspective. I wanted to just remind you that part of planning in your managing your time is being aware of strategic organizational issues, strategic changes that may again require planning and become the things that you do have to do, but require building blocks over time to get them all done. They're not something you can do in a day. So keep in mind that strategic planning is not just a daily task, but can involve some long-term and long-range goals. Managing time at work, the takeaway for this is to remember that leaders manage time in a way that helps them avoid being unproductive. Some examples of how leaders contain and control their time is to set clear time limits when they're meeting with staff. If they have a staff member that walks up to them when they're walking onto the floor and says, "Hey, do you have a minute? I have to talk to you," for the manager to look at them and say, "I'd be happy to talk with you. I have 10 minutes before my next meeting." Invite them in, remind them, "Okay, I got 10 minutes," and have them go through their needs. If at the end of that time they still have other things to cover, make an appointment and follow up with them later. In the process of having conversations with folks, especially if they're extemporaneous or they come out of the blue, being sure that you refocus the conversation. Say the same employee comes up and it meets you at the elevator and says, "Hey, can I talk to you? I have a problem with my schedule." And you say, "Okay, I've got 10 minutes." And they come into your office and they begin to talk about a problem that happened on night shift in between 2 other employees and how that really stressed them and they weren't happy. The manager to be able to say, "We're going to table that conversation and we're going to talk about it later this afternoon. Talk to me about your schedule so I can meet that need right now and we'll talk about the other situation later." Helping to refocus the conversation is a key skill. Avoid being too accessible. That open door policy is such a lovely idea, but the reality is managers that have a 100% open door policy are ineffective and often highly unproductive. Being willing to say to your folks, I have an open door policy for 2 hours around the change of shift. I'm going to be in my office from 7 till 9 every day unless I have a meeting that's in priority. Come in, talk to me, share with your concerns, doors open. But my core hours, let's say from 10 to 2, that's the time that I'm going to be working on planning. I'm going to set most of my meetings. I'm not going to be as available on the floor. I can make an appointment with you during that time, but I won't be just sitting in my office and easily interrupted. Being willing to set some limits on that open door policy is important. Balance is essential. If you've got a chaos going on your floor and it has been a really rough string a couple of days, you may need an open door policy for a couple of days because there's just a lot of churn and your folks need you. In quieter times, you may be unavailable more often. The idea is to create an expectancy from your team to know that they cannot misuse your time and misuse your availability. Patient care, this should not be a surprise to you. First priority, life-threatening. Second priority, your safety. Third priority, your comfort measures. Only thing I want to remind you is that there are a lot of NCLEX sources that view pain management and pain control as a level 2 safety issue. So just know that if you're going to deal with life-threatening things, and in the process of dealing with safety, that is probably where you're going to be dealing with pain control. Even though we know pain tucks under comfort measures, the new way of thinking is thinking about it as a safety second level priority issue. Daily planning, again, the thing to remember is that time management needs to be proactive and not crisis driven. One mistake that novice managers do all the time is they fail to plan their day at the beginning of the day and prioritize appropriately so their day gets hijacked. I want to remind you that short-term plans start the strategic planning process that lead to long-term goals. And we're going to talk more about strategic planning in a couple of weeks, but I do want you to be thinking about how you manage short-term plans. How you manage your day, manage your time is a building block that can be tucked into strategic planning that leads to productivity that helps support long-term goals. Just hang that idea together and understand that short-term planning is a building block. These are 5 priority setting traps. The big one that I see all the time is the squeaky wheel gets the attention. The person that is making you the craziest, that is underfoot, that is whining and complaining and making you miserable is the first person you want to stop talking to you. So you're more likely to address their wants, their needs, their demands before you deal with anything else. I'm going to encourage you that when you are dealing with a personality that finds complaining or need seeking to be their go-to, these are the people that you're going to set parameters with, that you're not going to encourage the behavior, that you'll set the same limits on those squeaky wheels that you would anyone else. The other one is whatever hits first. That's you're walking off the elevator and somebody pounces you. Folks, there are times that you're going to need to deal with whatever hits you first because it's critical, but that should not be your go-to for how you manage your day. If you do that, you will not be productive in managing your time, and you will be going home 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night with still things that were on your do now list, do today list that were never addressed. So avoid these traps as you move into a leadership position. Want to remind you that there are lots of tools out there for helping you manage your time. Just remember, tools are tools. They need to be flexible and they need to be appropriate for what you're doing. Personal organization, knowing and understanding how and why you use your time and set priorities as you do. The takeaway from this is to understand that many of us have this thinking that I'm good at doing multiple things at the same time. We call it multitasking. That is a misnomer. What research is telling us about our brain and how we process multiple competing activities and ideas is that we aren't multitasking, we're microtasking. So I'm doing a little bit of this project and then my brain is shifting and I'm doing a little bit of another project and then my brain is shifting again and I'm doing a little bit of another project. And so that microtasking, not multitasking, is actually not a productive way to approach our work behaviors or or other task behaviors. So one of the recommendations for how we personally organize our life is to do one thing at a time and do it well. To plan structure around how we're going to accomplish something, but not to get tangled up in I can do lots of things at once, because that's simply not true. I think this list does a good job of summarizing some other concepts. Personal characteristics of time wasting. Just want you to read this, self-identify what looks personal to you, and give some thought to how you can address those as you move into practice. This is a great list of internal and external time wasters. I want you to be able to be familiar with this list. I'm not going to ask you to spit it back to me, but I do want you to know the difference between what we do inside our heads and what occurs outside the environment, because we can be as disciplined as we want to be and have our plans straight, and we manage our time really well, and then we go into the external environment and our day gets hijacked. So think about, how do I contain my internal stuff and then control the external stuff to the best of my ability? Procrastination. Some of you could have written this definition yourself. Some of you were offended by it. I am not a procrastinator, so I get really irritable when I'm waiting on somebody to do something that they've put off to the last minute. Know if you're a procrastinator, because that's going to impact your practice as a bedside nurse, but it's really going to impact your practice as a nurse leader, and it's something that you want to be aware of. Time inventories are a great tool. Again, as I said earlier, any tool needs to be flexible. This one is specifically used in an organizational setting to look to see how time is being managed. Great example of this is I managed a group of outpatient practices, and I had my front office staff coming to me and saying, we need to hire a third front office person because we cannot keep up with the phones and the referrals and all of the billing that we had to do. We're drowning. So I said, okay, let's for a week, and if you're going to do a time inventory, it should be, normally we say 2 to 5 days. A week is a good yardstick because you want a variety of days covered, so you get an average, not just a snapshot like a day. So you're going to use a couple of days. I used 5 and said, we created a list of all the things that was in their job description and things they should be doing on a daily basis. And I had them mark down every time they did it. So interestingly, anytime the phone rang, they wrote it down. If they did a referral, they wrote it down. So it was tedious and they weren't terribly thrilled with it. But what we found at the end of the day, it was not the phone, it was not the billing, it was not making copies and building patient handouts. The thing that was sucking all of their time was the physicians in the back coming up and interrupting their day, asking them questions about logistics. Where can I find? Where does this go? Who has this? All day long, they were inundated with physician interruptions. So we didn't need a new person. We needed some professional courtesy and respect and some boundaries put with our physicians so they had a better resource to answer questions and not decrease the productivity of the front office. Time inventories are fantastic. They're good tools, but remember, you need to use them for a reasonable period of time, normally 2 to 5 days, to get a good snapshot of the actual events that are going on. You can also do this for yourself if you're trying to figure out, where is my time going, but be committed to being detail oriented. It can be a little tedious. Love this t-shirt. I wish I could wear it proudly now. Dear Naps, I'm sorry I was a jerk to you as a kid. Boy, do I wish I could take a nap sometimes. It is so important that whether you're at the bedside being a nurse leader there, or whether you're a leader in the hospital, or you're out in an outpatient setting, wherever you are, you have got to take breaks. You need to give time for your brain to process what it's experiencing, give yourself time to catch your break, to catch your breath, and be able to really recover from a level of stress. Now, many of you are going to say, Dr. Hudgens, I've been in the clinical setting through clinical, and I don't know when nurses ever take breaks. We're just so busy. I want to caution you that busy is the get out of jail free card we all use to have permission not to take care of ourselves. There is never going to be a time that you should not be taking care of yourself in some way, in some fashion. Yes, there are floors that you just have crazy days and you have a very hard time grabbing lunch, but that doesn't mean you skip lunch. It means that you work productively, you work collaboratively, so that if all you get is 10 minutes to go take a breath of fresh air, grab a sandwich, and inhale your lunch, you still need to do something to take breaks and to recover from the level of stress. Folks, I know that that is not always a reality, but if becomes our practice, then the days that are chaotic and we don't take breaks are the outlier. It should not be your baseline. Bronze 12 Habits of Master Time Management. These are interesting and valuable. I want you to read through them. Let's go through a few questions that deal with how to prioritize and manage care. The nurse is administering medication for patients on a medical unit. Which medication should the nurse administer first? A narcotic pain medicine to a patient with pain of 8 to 10, a loop diuretic to a client diagnosed with heart failure who has 3+ pitting edema, an anticholinesterase medication to a patient diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, or an antacid to a patient with pyrosis who has called several times over the intercom. In case you're wondering, D is the squeaky wheel. So, to answer this question, and this is a very good example of an NCLEX style critical thinking clinical rationale question. You've got to know lots of facts to be able to answer each of those. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about how you're going to prioritize this. And the correct answer is A. A narcotic pain medication to a patient with pain in an 8 in a scale of 10. And again, that goes back to what we said about a first priority, a second priority, and a third priority. Narcotic pain medication tends to be a safety measure, and we're going to treat it as such. The other concerns, B, C, and D, are not emergent issues that have to be addressed immediately. So if you had to prioritize, A is going to be your choice. A charge nurse has received lab data for a patient in a medical department. Which patient should require intervention by the charge nurse? I want to remind you, they're in a medical department. The patient diagnosed with a myocardial infarction who has an elevated troponin level. The patient receiving IV anticoagulate heparin who has a PTT of 68 seconds. The patient diagnosed with end-stage liver failure who has elevated ammonia levels, or the patient receiving the anticonvulsant Dilantin who has a level of 24 milligrams per deciliter. To answer this question, you need to know what an elevated troponin level means. You need to know what a normal PTT is. You need to know what a normal Dilantin level is. Again, we're at an NCLEX style question. The correct answer to this question is A, the patient diagnosed with myocardial infarction who has an elevated troponin level. The PTT is only slightly elevated, as is the Dilantin level, and a patient with end-stage liver is going to be expected to have an ammonia level that's elevated. So someone who has an elevated troponin level who has a diagnosis of an MI means that there is cardiac damage occurring.